So this month, I will be doing something a little bit different. For the month of August, I am doing what I'm calling the Sharpening Your Axe Summer Series, nonprofit strategy sessions on sustainability. August is a great time to slow down, to go deep, to learn, to plan, and to prepare for the hustle of the end of the year. Just like Abraham Lincoln said, if you give me 8 hours to chop down a tree, I'll spend 6 hours sharpening my axe. So, my goal with this series is to help you sharpen your proverbial organizational axe during the slower, somewhat days of summer. Each week, I'll be focusing on one of the core elements that make nonprofits strong: fundraising, boards, staff, finance, and organizational direction. Each week, I'll be sharing content that explores the theme from different angles, a combination of short form strategy tips, long form trainings that go deeper into some aspect of the theme, and always an encore podcast episode featuring me in more of a generative conversation with one of my incredible guests, exploring the theme from yet a third angle. These strategy sessions are fire. So grab a notebook, grab a pen, curl up someplace really comfy, and enjoy. Hi, this is the Nonprofit Mastermind podcast, and I'm your host, Richie-Babbage. Each week, I do a deep dive into the mindset and strategies and tactics and tools of scaling an incredible high-impact nonprofit. I'm so glad you're here. Hi, welcome to the 4-part Focus on Growth mini training series. In this training, I am introducing and walking through 4 concrete areas where you can sharpen your focus to help you grow your organization with more clarity and less overwhelm. Ultimately, my goal with these trainings is to help you reach more people, serve more communities, and really increase your impact and budget, and to do it smoothly and sustainably, which is the key, right? Without burnout. So we are in our 3rd week of the mini series, and this is the 3rd training. And in this mini training, I'm going to show you what to focus on in your finances and your budget to drive your growth, how to use your budget to drive growth. This is a really hyper-focused mini training specifically about budgets because it's such an important topic that I just wanted to focus one of the trainings on this topic. So with that in mind, I am going to aim my passion and my love for strategy and systems at our topic today. I am going to try to leverage what I think is my superpower, bringing order to chaos, to our conversation about money. Now, as I've tried to drive home in multiple other trainings, I also say this on my podcast all the time because I think it's really appropriate for so many settings and context for growing nonprofits. What got you to where you are is not going to get you to where you need to go. That is particularly true when we're talking about budgets and finances. Your organization is only truly going to grow when you are focused and strategic about how you think about your budget and your finances. Now, I've worked with a number of organizations on budgeting and strategic budgeting and the relationship between budgets and strategic planning. So I really understand all of the feelings that can come up when we start talking about finances. For some folks, it is downright scary, right? You don't have a background in finance. You didn't start an organization or become an executive director with a real grounding in accounting, and knowing where to start and being worried about getting things wrong can feel really intimidating. For others, it may not be scary, but it's really overwhelming. You don't know what you're doing or how to use all of the information at your disposal. There are a lot of numbers, there are a lot of documents. You have a whole QuickBooks account and chart of accounts and different reports that your director of operations is giving you, or your finance chair, committee chair is giving you. And it's just a lot. It's just overwhelming. I also get annoying a lot that I didn't start doing this work to spend my time budgeting and reading cash flow statements. that really you want to be doing the work itself. You want to be working with your team and out in the community, building partnerships, working with your board. And so having to think about finances is annoying. So I get all of that. I really do. But I'm going to ask you to stick with me for the length of this training at least, because I'd like to make the case that your finances and your budget in particular are really just part of the story that you are telling about your programming. It is a storytelling tool that is so powerful that it's absolutely critical that you master it. And I say that because we tend to separate budgets and finances from programming. But I'd actually like to make the case that they are part of the exact same story, right? So I'll get into that more. When you are focused on the right thing with your finances and with your budget, you create the interstitial tissue that ties your programming together. You bring in the finances and the revenue. That is what drives your programs and your impact. That's what ultimately allows you to have the impact you want to have. So today, we're specifically going to talk about the thing to focus on with your budget that will unlock the full potential of your fundraising. And that is growth budgeting. So a growth budget is a budget that reflects the true cost of your plans for growth. So like I said, I work with growth stage organizations, early growth stage and later growth stage. So no particular size, right? All the way up to 3 million, but organizations that really have their eye on leveling up their impact, growing their capacity, growing their staff, growing their board, growing their programs. And so this idea of a budget that tells the story of the true cost of that growth is something that I talk a lot about. Whatever your concrete vision for growth is in your strategic plan or in your annual plan, there's a number attached to that vision, the number and location of your programs, the scope of the work that you have planned, the staffing that you need, the partnerships you're developing, your IT needs, your marketing and communications and thought leadership. There are costs associated with each element of that impact, each element of that growth. And so your growth budget is what it will cost you to achieve and sustain your staffing, programming, space, IT, marketing, everything that you are describing in your vision. And I highlight and sustain because our goal as we grow and as we bring in revenue, as we think about fundraising, is not just to bring in more money. It's to actually sustain higher capacity, sustain higher revenue. So I often work with folks who base their fundraising on what they know they can raise or what they've raised in the past. This is what I call a what can I do this for mindset. And it might honestly be the number one thing that I see keeping people from growing their organization and from scaling their budget and their impact. When you think about growing your organization, starting with what you brought in last year and budgeting around that, creating a blueprint that is pegged to the past, what you know you were able to do or what you have committed, creates an implicit and sometimes explicit ceiling on what you're able to raise. A growth budget really requires you to think, what is that number that I need to be raising that would actually fund my vision and propel my organization forward? That is a true cost budget. It is a budget that reflects the actual cost of your vision. So you're moving, and this is really both a mindset and a strategic shift. You're moving from what can I do with what I have, which creates a ceiling, to what do I need? What's the North Star? What is the cost of this vision? And there's no ceiling there, right? There, maybe you're stretching. You're reaching a little farther financially than you thought you would, and it might be a little uncomfortable, but that's how you actually grow, right? That's how the budget begins to be the blueprint for your actual growth? Now, I get this question a lot, so I want to address it right up front. It is absolutely fine and happens all the time that you will have both a growth budget and what I call a needs-based budget. So what this basically means is that sometimes your growth budget is going to be different than your board approved budget, which is very often sort of needs-based, right? Especially with early growth stage organizations, this bifurcation of the budgets, the board approved, more conservative, reflects sort of incremental growth, really often needs to be justified with, we can show 75% commitment to this already. And so we're really only raising 25% of the budget. We're only on the hook for X amount that we can't already account for. Those will tend to be in the early growth stages, right? Where you're still nailing your revenue engine, right? What is your particular approach to fundraising? Is your organization strong in terms of bringing in revenue? As you're figuring that out and sort of getting your sea legs, as it were, your budgets will tend to be more conservative, at least the ones that the board will be comfortable approving. It is okay to still have a separate growth budget that is more aspirational, that reflects the true cost of growth. You use this growth budget as an external storytelling tool so that when you sit down with potential donors and funders and they ask the question, how much do you need from me? What investment would help you? Where are you trying to go with your fundraising, right? When you have these kinds of investment focused conversations with prospects, prospective donors, prospective funders, and even current donors and funders where you're trying to upgrade or level up their gifts, you have a tool, your budget, that actually tells the story of your growth. It doesn't have to be your board approved budget. You can have both. What I often find is that later growth stage organizations that have their sort of fundraising sea legs will have one budget and their growth budget will be approved by the board. But you can have both. So why is this so important to have a growth budget? Simply put, your budget is your blueprint for growth for the year. It serves as the foundation for your fundraising plan and your fundraising strategies. You are going to have a very different approach to fundraising if your budget is $600,000 than if it is $1.5 million. Right? The strategies you're going to use, who you're going to talk to, what you're going to ask funders and donors for, all of that changes based on what you're trying to raise. And your budget is what tells you what you're trying to raise, right? So you want your budget to be an accurate reflection of your growth plan because it becomes your blueprint for fundraising. So that's at the core of why this is so, so important and how focusing on developing an accurate true cost growth budget ultimately winds up driving and fueling your growth because it is your blueprint, right? At the foundation of everything. You want to start with the question, how much do I need to raise to fund our vision for increased impact? And again, I'm assuming we're talking about growth here. So there's two ways to answer this question. One is incremental, right? So the first question you're asking when you make your budget is, how much do I need to raise? I think that's what we always sit down and ask. And so one answer is, and I think a lot of nonprofits start here, well, what did I raise last year? Right? What do I feel comfortable? What do I know we can bring in? What do I have committed? And then you add a bit of stretch. So you look at your past budget or you look at your past sort of revenue for the past year, and then you grow it a little bit, 10%, 20%. When you do that, when you incrementally grow your budget, just based on or pegged to, baselined against your past year, you don't actually wind up with a fundraising plan that gets you the money you need to grow. You wind up with a fundraising plan that gets you what you raised last year plus 10%. That's it. Which, if it is divorced from your strategic plan, your annual plan, what you actually want to do and the true cost of what you want to do and how you want to grow, then you're not actually fundraising for what you need. And that vicious cycle of being under resourced, not having staff capacity, not being able to grow your team and your programs and your partnerships, you can see how it's really rooted in, at its simplest, not actually having a budget that drives, fuels, creates a blueprint for true cost of your growth. So year after year, you're creating a budget that's only based on partially committed revenue or last year's numbers. That's going to be the amount you continue to raise. And so what you find is that your budget isn't being leveraged as a storytelling tool, right? You don't have the tools you need to communicate your true need to donors, which leads to my second point. And remember this, if you take nothing else away from this mini training, your budget is one of your most powerful fundraising storytelling tools. It uses numbers to paint a picture of the kind of impact you're trying to have. And then your fundraising plan is how you fuel that impact. So in practice, if you're trying to grow, if you're trying to scale, your growth budget has to help you tell the story of how you're trying to grow, right? Of your planned impact. You have to be able to sit down with prospective supporters who say to you, how much are you trying to raise? And tell them the story of, this is what we're trying to do in the world. And therefore, this is how much we want to raise, right? Think of it like a storybook, a children's storybook. On one side, you have the words, and on one side, you have a picture. That should be the relationship between your annual strategy plan or your strategic plan and your budget. They should tell a story. So it is really different when you get the question, how much are you trying to raise, to start with the numbers, right? Because the numbers are based on the numbers, meaning this year's budget is based on last year's budget and can be divorced without us meaning to do it. We're divorcing the numbers from the impact, from the strategy. So that first story is, last year we brought in 500,000 and we did so much with that. It was a really great year. And we're hoping to bring in 525 this year because we have this waiting list in our programs, right? Like you're leading with the numbers because that's what your budget is rooted in, last year's numbers. So you're sort of starting with the budget and the incremental growth. What having a growth budget, and this is subtle very often, but it's a really powerful shift. What it allows you to do is tell a different kind of story, create a different story arc. You can sit down and say, David, I'm so glad you asked that question. Our vision for the year, our plan, is to double the number of people that we reach through our programs with a deep focus on these two communities, because that's where we found we're seeing increased need. That's our vision for growth. We're raising $750,000 to meet that need. That's the cost of that growth. And I'd love to walk you through our plan for raising that money so you can see exactly how a gift from you will fit into that vision. Leading with your vision and knowing that the budget will tell the same story means that you can center the vision, not the numbers. You can say, let me tell you about what we're trying to do. Because ultimately, when someone says, how much are you trying to raise? They want to know how much you're trying to raise to have it the impact that we care about in the world, right? That we want to be part of. So you lead with that impact because you know at a core level that your budget's going to back you up. And you can bring that number in as the picture next to the words, right? As the supplement that just enhances, look, I've painted the picture for you. Here's the number. And then you have the third pillar document. Now let me walk you through the fundraising plan and how you fit. And there's a synergy there that makes sense to people and resonates with people and helps them know you actually know what it takes to get to this vision that you have in mind. And that's actually really, really important when it comes to using your budget as a storytelling tool, and really important when it comes to growing your revenue through investment level fundraising. You cannot assume that your current supporters or even board members, and definitely not prospective supporters, understand what you need and why you need it. They don't necessarily understand the cost of your programs and what growth will mean in terms of expanded admin costs and staffing and capacity and IT and back office. You understand that. And so you have to paint that picture for them. You're only going to raise what you truly need by being clear about what you truly need. And that starts with your budget. So why am I focusing on this so much? Why did I make this the focal point of an entire mini training? Because every week, multiple times a week, I talk to nonprofit CEOs and organizations that are running organizations that are absolutely rocking it from a programmatic perspective. They are out in the world doing it. They are serving people and building community and having real impact, and they're growing their impact and they're trying to keep up. They know that the work that their team and their board and their organizations and their partners are doing in the world is having an impact and is meaningful. They know it, they can see it. But they are still struggling with payroll at some point every year, often multiple times a year. They stress about money. They don't have enough funding to feel comfortable expanding the way that they want to. So there is this disconnect between the impact that they're having and their financial comfort. That is because very often needs-based budgeting perpetuates a plateau of funding and thus a plateau of impact. When you base your budget only on what you've raised in the past, you create this ceiling, right? That's how it shows up, that you're doing great work, but you can't quite get above this funding level because you're essentially looking backwards. You are raising what you've raised, what you are comfortable raising. You can't invite people into a bigger story, an aspirational story, or a story of growth for your full vision because your numbers don't back you up. The key is that you have to know what you truly need and then aim everything at that number, your conversations, what you talk to your board about, what you and your staff are aiming at, the kinds of funders and donors you're trying to have conversations with and build relationships with. You want to create an overall financing model and fundraising plan that raises that number. So you have to be honest and clear about that number. Ultimately, when your budget reflects your true need and your vision for growth, you'll have the framework, the focus, and the tools you need to invite people into that vision, to grow your revenue, to expand your capacity, and thus to grow your impact. So let's recap. We talked about how in order to grow, you have to be focused and strategic about your organization's finances and your budget in particular. We talked about how you need a growth budget to tell the story of your plans for increased impact if you are going to invite investment in that increased impact. We talked about how your growth budget is the roadmap for your fundraising. Ultimately, each of these elements is critical and they build on one another. Your growth budget lays the foundation for a realistic, honest fundraising plan, right? And by realistic, I mean, what do you really need? Like that grows directly out of having an accurate, true cost growth budget. Having a realistic, true fundraising plan that is actually pegged to what you need to grow brings in expanded fundraising. You have different conversations, bigger gifts, multi-year general operating support gifts, because you're having a different kind of conversation because your numbers are helping you tell the story. And ultimately, that leads to growth, right? So they all build on one another and they start with your growth budget. It's a fundamental driver of true growth. Now, what I've been trying to show with these trainings is the critical framework shifts and strategies to focus on to make your organizational growth smoother and less overwhelming. I've put these trainings together because, as I said in the beginning, I've been doing this work for decades. And one thing I know is that you can't cobble together and reverse engineer smooth growth just based on what you think you're seeing in other organizations. And I highlight this here because budgeting and finances and fundraising, there's nothing more true than you can't reverse engineer based on what you're seeing above the surface, the tip of the iceberg. You see a beautiful gala. You see staff that is growing. You see a director of development that's doing development work. You see this growth. But what you aren't seeing is that beneath the surface, there are shifts that are happening. There is an intentionality about budgeting and financing that may be scary and may be hard, but that is actually driving and sustaining growth. It's new approaches to major donor asks. It's a fundraising strategy based on a growth budget, right? It's training for your board about getting comfortable with growth budgeting and why that's so important. When you actually see what drives growth, you're able to grow more smoothly. There is a method to this madness. And that's what I'm trying to do with these trainings is pull back the curtain so that your organization can see what's under the surface, right? What the base of the iceberg is actually all about. When it comes to budgeting, when it comes to growing financially, growing your revenue, the base of that iceberg is your growth budget. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of the Nonprofit Mastermind podcast. I always have so much fun doing these episodes. Definitely check out the links to all the goodies that I mentioned in this episode. You can get that at richie-babbage.com/podcast for the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode and think that you have a friend or colleague who would also enjoy, I would love if you would leave a review and share. Have a great week.